Put a disclaimer.
Yeah, okay.
That I am a retired Foreign Service officer. My remarks do not in any way reflect the positions of the Department of State or the United States government. These are my views alone. Great. Well, I'm always happy to be back in BC. The back in the day that Eric referred to was the class of 1977. So.
Let's put dates on it. Yeah.
Quite a ways back, and my father was class of 1939, and my son was the class of 2009. So the family has a long history at Boston College. Originally, I'm from Melrose, just north of Boston. For those who don't know the area, and while I was at BC, I studied history and political science. And international studies wasn't really a thing then. You sort of had to. I think most people who are interested in an international career did history or political science or economics going forward. So came out of Boston College and went to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy for 2 years. During that time, I applied to join the Foreign Service. I had become interested in the Foreign Service because my uncle, also a BC graduate, joined the Foreign Service actually just before the Second World War. So, I'm giving my age away quite often here. But interestingly, when he joined the service, it was still very exclusively a white Anglo-Saxon Ivy League institution. So, I was very proud of him that he, coming out of Boston College, came into the service and had an excellent career, largely in doing international labor issues in Europe and South America. These days, and by the time I was applying for the service, they had at least broken out of the Ivy League mold, and people from many different universities were starting to join. And during the 1980, when I joined, the service was really reaching out to women quite a bit because we had largely been a male preserve before that. But I know in my career, I think I have had more female bosses than male bosses in the service, and I think state has done a good job on gender diversity. You will find that it's still somewhat lacking on racial and ethnic diversity. I don't think that it is no longer because of any institutionalized policy by the State Department. It's largely because we have not been able to attract people to apply for the test and get into that career. One of the things state has done, and I am going to recommend that you, if you're seriously interested in Foreign Service, you reach out to them, is they have placed the diplomats in residence in a variety of regions. There is one for New England. I don't have the immediate contact information, but the place to go for everything about Foreign Service is career.state.gov, and you'll find contact information for that person and anything else you want to know about the service. I spent 38 plus years with the Foreign Service, and before that I did 2 years with the Immigration and Naturalization Service while I was in grad school at Logan Airport as an immigration inspector. But 40 years of government service. I retired in 2018. When I retired, I was the ambassador to Suriname. A prize for anyone who can tell me the capital city of Suriname. First up. Okay, not a surprise at all. It's Paramaribo. Most people don't even know where Suriname is. It's on the north coast of South America, just north of Brazil, and between Guyana and French Guyana. And it was Dutch Guyana until 1975 when it became an independent country. So that's where my final job of my career was ambassador, but many things before then. Because of my interests were largely in European history, I tried to focus a lot on European assignments, East-West relations, NATO issues. Served in Canada was my first assignment in Ottawa. Came back to the State Department worked on political military affairs, and that became sort of a sub-specialty for my career. In the mid-'80s, I worked with a lot of our NATO allies on something called the Missile Technology Control Regime, which was designed to keep advanced missile technology from countries that were trying to develop delivery systems for nuclear weapons. I think we had our most success in that era with Argentina and Brazil, who were both at the time trying to develop weapons and delivery systems. And by cutting off their access to advanced technology and negotiating carefully with them, both countries eventually abandoned those programs, which is a very positive step forward. And of course, we were trying to keep our most advanced technology out of the hands of the Soviet Union. This was the Cold War era. And for most of the 80s, I did East-West relations and East-West arms control issues. I was in Stockholm, Sweden for about a year and a half in a negotiation on what at the time we called confidence and security building measures, which were ways to be notified by the Russians and the Russians to be notified by NATO of large-scale military exercises, to send observers, and to allow inspectors to come and inspect those exercises. We had success there. It was the first time the Soviets had ever agreed to on-site inspection without right of refusal. So that was a major breakthrough then. And of course, over the course of history, these things tend to diminish quite a bit, but it was a major thing then. And then through the end of the 80s and into the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, I was working on conventional arms control in Europe and the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, which we also were able to sign. Coming back I then went to Norway as the political military affairs officer, and that leads me to talk about some of the things you get to do in the Foreign Service that you may never have gotten to do. Because I was doing military affairs in Norway, and we were very interested in the Soviet Navy, and subsequently the Russian Navy, cutting off the Atlantic to resupply issues. North Norway was critical, so I managed to spend a lot of time in the far north, in the Arctic, polar bears, midnight sun, all of that stuff, and at government expense, which is always important to remember. Later in my career, I was in Greenland to negotiate a basing agreement with Denmark as the sovereignty in Greenland, and managed to go to Thule Air Force Base, which is about 800 miles from the North Pole, and went on up by helicopter to an Inuit village, had a three-course meal of various whale meats, which I could do because they were caught by indigenous peoples and not by commercial whaling, which would have been illegal. And just an incredible experience to enjoy the far north that a lot of people never get to do. So coming back from Norway, I spent about 6 years in Washington, 2 years on exchange to the Defense Department, where I was the country director for the Nordic countries and the Baltic states. And at that time, what we were trying to do was integrate the Baltics into the Western Alliance and eventually joining NATO, because of course this was after the fall of the Warsaw Pact. Very exciting time, spent a lot of time traveling in Eastern Europe and in the Nordic region. A lot of fun, and we had, I think we had great success. I think if you look today at the Ukraine crisis, you see that the Baltics and the Eastern Europeans are the strongest allies of Ukraine in providing, in addition to the United States, most of the assistance. So they've been very successfully integrated into the West, which I think was a great step forward. Then I moved on to sort of another phase of my career. I was assigned to Dublin in 1998, right after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. Spent 4 years there, largely working on implementation of the agreement. I was sort of the Sinn Féin whisperer, Sinn Féin being the Republican Party in Ireland and at that time the political wing of the Irish Republican Army. But they were a signatory to the agreement and then were brought into the fold, accepted the end of the armed conflict, and we worked very closely with them with Jerry Adams, with Martin McGuinness, if you know some of the principal players of that. Even though I was in Dublin, I was in Northern Ireland quite a bit for negotiations. And I think being with the last name Nolan, my wife and I, my wife's last name is maiden name was O'Neill. Going back to Ireland was sort of what we always thought would be a successful career in the Foreign Service if we could get to if we could get to Dublin. So we loved it there. Again, when you're on these assignments, your housing is provided. Salaries are never going to be fabulous in the Foreign Service. I mean, some of you are majoring in finance and economics, and if you know, maximizing your salary is what you're looking for, probably not Foreign Service. But I was just looking the other day. Your starting salaries these days, depending on qualifications, are between 50 and 80,000. Level of qualifying experience, what level of education you have, language skills, etc. But what you need to remember is when you're overseas, your housing is paid for. You're getting cost of living adjustments, and if you're in high expense places, you tend to be able to live as if you had a higher salary, just because of the various perks you get, and you see the world on the government's dime. So it's a lot of fun. So coming out of Ireland, I came back. At one point, I was the deputy director of the Office of Policy Planning for Latin America. I was the director of the Canadian Affairs Office. I served in Canada again from 2013 to 2015. Between 2010 and 2013, I was at the United States Embassy in The Hague. I went as deputy chief of mission. That's the second to the ambassador in a diplomatic mission, and frankly, the guy who does most of the work. But our ambassador left after about a year, so I spent, and we were very slow in filling that job for about 2 years. I was the chargé d'affaires. I was the acting ambassador there. Worked a lot on Afghan issues because the Dutch were involved in Afghanistan. Certainly a lot of economic issues with the courts there, the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. We worked with the courts a lot. And you'll find when you go to large embassies in Europe, it's not only State Department that's represented. I had 14 federal agencies working with representatives at our embassy, from the Justice Department, from FBI, from DEA, even had NCIS as a people there, because the European Police organization is headquartered in The Hague. So it was a very diverse assignment and a lot of great issues to deal with. When you come into the service, you need a couple of things. One, you need to have a commitment to public service, because there are sacrifices you're making. I loved representing the United States overseas, and I think that was the major attraction for me into entering the Foreign Service. Are we always right in our foreign policy decisions? No. Certainly there have been mistakes made over the years. I've disagreed with policies that have been taken. And when you disagree, you can express those within the building. You can offer different perspectives to your superiors, and sometimes they may take them and sometimes they don't. But you have to be ready for some service discipline as well. When the secretary or the president or the undersecretaries identify a policy, whether you agree with it or not, your job is to support the policy with that foreign government. I found that I served under 8 presidents. Jimmy Carter was the president when I entered, and of course Donald Trump was the president when I retired. I found between Democratic and Republican foreign policy, there were very few dramatic differences. I think until very recently, foreign policy did really end at the water's edge. Yeah, there were nuances between administrations always, but the general direction was the same: support for human rights, support for democracy, support for free trade conditions. So I worked under great secretaries of state from both parties, from George Shultz and James Baker, who were tremendous secretaries, to Hillary Clinton, who fortunately I got to know a little bit, and John Kerry and others. The Foreign Service, I think by necessity, tends to be non-political, non-partisan. You're dealing with both parties. Now, I would say that the State Department might have a slight tilt to the left in its bias. I also worked at the Defense Department, which has that tilt to the right a bit. But if your goal is to be engaged in partisan politics, and there's nothing wrong with that, but the state and sort of civil service is not probably the best place to be. Then you want to seek elected office, be active in party politics. You could still be an ambassador. As you probably know, there are two types of ambassadors. There's what I am, which was a career ambassador. So I was named under President Obama and served under President Trump. When the administration changed, they didn't clear us all the career ambassadors out. We usually stay on and serve our 3-year tour. But there are also political ambassadors who come from outside, named by the president, and do tend to change if an administration changes. So that there's always that option for you as well. A couple of things I do want to mention. Families. It can be a difficult career for families, particularly if your spouse or partner has a career that is not easily movable. I think it's becoming easier because so many people are doing remote work now. But for instance, my wife was a high school teacher. I entered the service after she'd been teaching for 3 years and had just gotten tenure. She hasn't been able to teach since then because she was out of the loop, and if she came back, she'd have to take a number of courses to get caught back up. So you have to weigh that career balance when you're going in. Also with families, it can be difficult with kids. Schooling isn't always the best in every place you go. We were fortunate. My son and daughter went to school in Norway and in Ireland and in Cyprus, where I was also deputy chief of mission. And they were able to get good educations, and well, my son got into BC, so we were very happy with that. And they loved the Foreign Service life, but for some families it just doesn't work with the kids. Particularly if you have a special needs kid, it can be very difficult. So those are just things to as you think about a Foreign Service career, to think about. The service, as you might know, has generalist officers and specialist officers. I think what most of you are probably interested in is the generalist officer. That's the standard Foreign Service diplomatic officer. And even there, we're divided into subsets, which we call cones. There's political, which is what I was, economic, administrative, management, consular, and public diplomacy. Political does mostly policy issues. Economic does economic policy issues. Those are pretty easy to understand. Management is it's running embassies, running the department. It's what you would think of as management. It's human resources, budgets, all those issues. Consular, those are the people who are doing visas and American citizen services. If you like to serve people directly, that's a great cone to be in, because even though no one will ever admit that you've helped them, you will get to help a lot of people, whether it's Americans in distress overseas, Americans in prison, people coming to the United States who need certain types of visas. If you have the right attitude going into that, it can be a very lucrative, not lucrative, but rewarding career. Public diplomacy, when I entered the service, public diplomacy was a real afterthought. It now is a real driver of everything we do. Everything has a media or public relations aspect, whether you're running, for instance, in Suriname, we ran PrEPFAR, which was the president's program to reduce AIDS through getting people on drugs immediately when they come on board, that we put a lot of money in. But it's important that you also get that message out, that people know the program's there, that they know it's coming from the United States. And as we always like to say, it's not coming from the State Department, it's coming from the American people. So you need strong public relations. Media is everywhere now, and you always have to be on your toes to react. And frankly, often political officers and economic officers don't have the best grasp of how to deal with the media. So we need that advice, and also to get up on social media platforms. It's very critical. So another area to think about while you're there. I'm going to wrap it up so we can get to your comments and questions in a minute now. I did want to say, about essential skills. For the variety, most of the cones, writing is critical. You don't have to be a great novelist, but you have to be able to write quickly and clearly and succinctly. A lot of what you do is reporting on conversations you've had with your contacts overseas. You're reporting back to the department, to people who are dealing with multiple embassies in multiple places and getting multiple reports a day. They don't have time to read your treatise on the biodiversity in Suriname, even though it's a critical issue. You've got to get it. You got to get it down to a couple of paragraphs with the main message that they can take and factor into policy decisions coming up. We used to say that if you have an important message, you better get it into the summary, which is usually a one-paragraph summary of your reporting. I think nowadays we say if you have an important message, you better get it into the subject line. So you really have to be a good writer. And also, clearly, it's diplomacy. You have to be able to get along with people. People you like, people you don't like, people who are scoundrels, people who are saints. I'll give you one example of that. In Suriname, I was dealing with the president of Suriname, a fellow named Desi Bouterse, elected in relatively clean elections, but he had been in the 1980s a military coup leader. He had executed 15 of his political opponents, and while I was ambassador, he was on trial for that, finally. To compound the issue, he was under indictment in the Netherlands for drug trafficking, and his son was in a U.S. federal penitentiary for drug trafficking and arms dealing. He was trying to sell arms to Hezbollah. So this made for an interesting relationship. But still, he was the president. He was democratically elected. So we had to deal with him. We had good functional relations. We got some things done. We were providing a lot of assistance to Suriname and law enforcement issues and anti-money laundering. And unfortunately, the main industries in Suriname tend to be drug trafficking and money laundering. But we tried to make some progress there and move things forward. And I had a good working relationship with them. Now, some people you're going to find are just very easy to deal with. And one of the things that you need to know is, and be a good judge of character, who you can trust, who who you can't trust, who you can tell things to that will help, and who you can tell things to that they'll use to screw you with. So it's always it's always a balancing act, and having those good interpersonal skills critical to moving forward. You're going to see when you look into the tests that they now have something like 13 precepts or something that foreign service officers should have. It's probably gotten a little too specific, but that's how they're doing it. The testing process isn't easy, and it's long. First you take the Foreign Service exam, which in some spots is like an SAT, sort of, or in others is writing samples that they want. Obviously, I mentioned writing. And if you get through that process, then you go for a qualitative assessment, which is kind of an all-day interview, where they give you a lot of work situations and ask you how you deal with them. It's not based on you having specific knowledge. They just want to see how you think. When I did it, it was much different. You spent an hour with a 3-man panel grilling you, and then you went outside while the jury deliberated your fate. And they told you immediately whether you were in or out. And the first time, didn't make it. I went through the process again. So it's something you can do multiple times. All right, I should stop talking and we should get to your question. So just let me say this. If you want to do foreign policy, I don't think there's a better place than the Foreign Service. If you want to study foreign policy, go into academia, go into media, go into journalism. But if you actually want to be on the ground and conducting United States foreign policy, this is the place to do it. Not the only place. There are other agencies, CIA, obviously, NSA. There's 2 other foreign service organizations, the Foreign Commercial Service, which is out of the Commerce Department, and the Foreign Agricultural Service out of the Agricultural Department, that you can also look at going forward. But I spent close to 40 years in the Foreign Service, didn't regret a minute of it. Yeah, there are challenges, family challenges and other things, but it was terrific. And I encourage you to join because, particularly young people today, because we, unfortunately, during the previous administration, a lot of us had severe problems with a lot of the policies that were in place, and very many senior officers resigned, were forced out, or in my case, retired. So the service was hurt over the last few years. It needs bright young people to come in and restore it. And I know from my experience at Boston College, you're getting a great education and background to do that. So I'm going to stop there. Questions, comments?
Thanks so much.
Yes, ma'am. Sophie.
So first, thank you for sharing all that information. It was super helpful. I have 2 quick questions. So one, it seems like you were in some pretty sought after areas in your career. So I was wondering, how much say do you get in where you're sent as a diplomat?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
then my second question would be, if for whatever reason moving around a lot doesn't work for your family or your lifestyle in the future, can you transition to a more stable career in the State Department in DC,
Mm-hmm.
for example?
I'll answer the second question first because that's the easier one. Yes, State Department is Foreign Service and Civil Service. So you can transition to a civil service job that will keep you in Washington. You lose, obviously, the travel benefits, but a lot of people I know have started in Foreign Service and have switched over if it just doesn't work from a family perspective, or even some people just love working in Washington. And I found at various times in my career you have more input in Washington. And also in the Foreign Service, you've got to be there a certain amount of time to have a corridor reputation, whether it's good or bad. But that sort of factors into the first part of your question, assignments.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, there's a stylized rigorous assignment policy. Every summer, you take an assignment, it's 2 or 3 years overseas, or 2 years in Washington. Usually Washington assignments are 2 years, even though people will do multiples. You can stay 6 years in Washington. But they put out a list of all the vacancies at your grade level, or you can bid on one grade up, and you submit your preferences, which you call bid list, and then you start lobbying. You talk to the people who would be your boss. You talk to assignments officers, and this is where I talked about corridor reputation. If you have a mentor, you work with them. It's sort of how I managed to stay largely in the European sphere, which was what my interest was. Because as you work in Washington, and I was in the European Bureau, you get to know the senior people there who have a lot of influence on assignments. There are requirements, though, to serve at what we call hardship posts. And you can find the particular details at that website I told you about, but everyone's expected to do a hardship post at some point in their career. I did it when I was ambassador, which is not a bad time to do it, because earlier in my career I had medical issues, but we won't go into that in any great detail. So it's a combination of a formal system and an informal effort on your part to get the jobs that you want. But you do have to, for ultimate advancement in the service, you need to show that you can do 2 regions. So I did Latin America, Western Hemisphere, and Europe. Because one of the things about the service is it's like the military in that it's up or out. You come in at a certain grade level, and you have a certain number of years to get promoted to the next grade level, or you are out. And then you have a certain number of years to get to senior foreign service, or you're out. The ameliorating part of that, though, is if you're 50 and you have 20 years of service, you're eligible for a pension. So even if people don't make it to the highest levels, they're not out on the street with nothing. So and the pension, foreign service pensions and government pensions are good. Health benefits are good. As we say, you'll never be rich in the foreign service, but you'll probably never be poor either. It's a good middle class career. Yes, sir.
So as I mentioned when I came in, I'm studying Islamic studies in that area. You mentioned that it's important to have specialties in 2 fields. You said you were Latin America and Europe. One of the concerns I have is that I am very centered on the Middle East. Is that something I should be concerned about?
No, not coming in. You don't need the 2 fields coming in. Yeah, after you don't need any field. No. It's interesting, the Foreign Service. It's one of those places where the test is the key. If you can pass the test and get through the assessment process, you're in. I mean, you don't need a bachelor's degree technically. The test is what you have to get through. But when you get into the service, then in order to have the most likely promotion prospects, and you will want to get promoted, you'll want to develop an expertise beyond your primary one. So if you serve, one tour in another region and maybe have a Washington job focused on that region, that's usually enough to give you that. And then you can, particularly if you're an Arabic speaker, they'll love to focus you on that region, because it's a very difficult language, as I'm sure you're finding out. It's hard to find people with those skills. And also, unlike a lot of the assignments I had, now I went to Norway and I studied Norwegian for 24 weeks, and then trying to find a Norwegian who'd speak Norwegian with me was very difficult, because Norwegians all speak excellent English, or virtually everyone. And then in the Netherlands, the same thing. I've never met a Dutchman who didn't speak perfect English. But if you're in China, if you're in Russia, if you're in the Arab world, you're not going to find that many English speakers, so you need the language. Yes, ma'am.
Kind of segue, my question was going to be about language. So did the U.S. government set up for you to learn the language of where
Yes.
you were for each place you moved to?
Yes. we have something called the Foreign Service Institute, which is in Arlington, Virginia. It's like a college campus. They provide training in all kinds of fields, but they're teaching something like 78 or 80 languages. And you will go, if say I was assigned to Norway, 6 months before I went, I started Norwegian language training, 24 weeks of language training, and then you test out, and I tested at the proficient level. Today I couldn't speak 3 words of Norwegian probably, because that was 30 years ago. But they will give you those languages, and if you're in what we call a super hard language like Arabic, you'll do 2 years of training if you don't already have the language. You go to Tunis. You do Washington a year, and then you go to Tunis, where we have a language center, for a year. If you're going to China, for instance, you'll do a year in Washington, a year in Taiwan. Russian, I think, is a 44-week language. You do that all in Washington. But they teach all kinds of languages. Even though, as Americans and English speakers, we're kind of blessed that English is the global language, and most of the elites you'll be speaking to will be English speakers. Okay.
Thank you.
Yes.
You mentioned specialist ambassadors as well as general. How did they differ?
The specialists in the Foreign Service tend to be in more technical fields, security, diplomatic security service, communications, the people who keep our satellites and classified communications networks up and running. There are some specialists in financial sections, like management and budget, particularly budget experts, and they serve overseas as well. And it's a somewhat different assignment process, but the assignments are pretty much the same length. I know many people who've gone into the diplomatic security service. They take a lot of people who come out of the military, as you can imagine. But it's not, it is security. It's not really a policy position. And that's the main difference is, the specificity of specialists as you get in the word, and generalists who tend to focus more on policy issues. Who else? I can blather on.
What are some steps you would consider taking prior to taking the exam, going for a bachelor's degree, or entering into another career field prior to going into the Foreign Service?
Okay.
Or would you suggest going straight in?
It's a real mix, and if you know the Foreign Service is what you want to do, the earlier you get in, the better. But I know many people who've started other careers come in when I entered the service, you couldn't be over 35, but now you can't be over 59. So it's wide open to people who want to come in. I know many lawyers who've joined the Foreign Service. Went to law school, came out, practiced law for a few years, just didn't appeal to them, and came into the Foreign Service. And law school is a very good basis to join the Foreign Service. Other people, you can go to graduate school, develop your expertise, and in your instance in the Middle Eastern areas, or you can just go out and do something else for a while. And sometimes those people bring in different experiences and expertise that's very helpful to the service. So it has become much broader, the age range that comes in, and the people from different backgrounds that come into the service, which is, I think, a positive. As the Obama administration always said, they wanted the civil service to look more like America, and I think state tended to be a laggard on that, but they're coming along now. I'm trying to look here if anything else I wanted to mention. And I do want to focus on, if you love travel, it's a great career. Places I never would have gotten to. I've been to Petra, was in Damascus before the Syrian civil war started. Got to take my family to these places. They wouldn't have gotten. My son came away with the travel bug. I mean, I think he's traveling most of the time during the year. Somehow my daughter slipped away from me and ended up at Alabama as her. Yes.
I have a quick question about workplace culture. Are foreign service officers, is it typically more individualistic and competitive, or is there like a very strong team dynamic?
It's two answers. In Washington, it tends to be a little competitive. And I think that's just the nature of Washington. But when you get overseas in an embassy, it really is a family. You work, the agent, in particular, you know, the agencies, in Washington, the interagency process is ugly and mean and nasty, whether you're with the Defense Department or Justice or whoever. Overseas, you work with those agencies, they're your friends, and you know, and in some places you're kind of isolated, so you're seeing them all the time, families are together. I just love the atmosphere in an embassy overseas. So I think you'd like it now, but you do have to do the flip side too. I mean, and I'm not saying that people are trying to stab you in the back in Washington, always, maybe occasionally, but it's just, you know, you're in a massive organization. You know, often state with our, you know, 30,000 employees is battling the Defense Department with 1 million plus and a budget that's through the roof. My 2 years at the Defense Department, I went over and was the country director for the Northern region, the Nordic region. It was a totally different world. I had the defense minister of Finland coming that we arranged a visit for. She wanted to go to St. Louis to see them build F-18s because they were buying them. She wanted to go to Cheyenne Mountain to see the war room. She wanted to go to New Orleans to hear some jazz. I made a call, got a government airplane, bang, we went everywhere. Had the Danish defense minister one time. He wanted to go to an aircraft carrier. Okay, set that up. We flew out to the carrier, landed, you know, catching the wire, got catapulted off. At state, you're worried if you take a government pen home. It's just a difference in cultures and budget. State always has to fight for budget. And it's largely because there's no real domestic constituency for foreign policy. The Defense Department has a domestic constituency because they bring jobs, they bring bases, they bring money into local economies, so Congress has no problem raising their budget. State, it's always it's a tooth and nail fight, but we make do. Yes, sir.
I have a quick question, like more specific one. I'm a dual citizen.
Yes.
I recently became naturalized.
Mm-hmm.
Is there like conditions or like restrictions for FSOs when they like
There's
travel? Can I serve in like?
Well, there's no specific prohibition on having a dual citizenship, particularly if you already have it. If you're in the Foreign Service and try to acquire another citizenship, they'll look a little askance at you. For instance, in Ireland, if you have a grandparent who's Irish, you can become a citizen. I have a grandparent who's Irish. I always wanted to apply for Irish citizenship, but I never did it while I was in the service. I'm doing it. I'm in the process of doing it now. But for you, if you're born with another citizenship, not a problem. That said, if you get into the service and they do a security background investigation, they will look into that. I mean, it's just a fact of life, because you'll have access to classified information, and like the rest of us, they do a very detailed background investigation, unless you own Mar-a-Lago. But no political comments. Yeah, but it's not a block to your joining.
Would I be able to serve in like the country that I have a citizenship in?
That one is a little more. It's case by case basis. Again, for instance, with Ireland, which is what I know best, the president named President Bush named a political ambassador to Ireland, as it always is. This political ambassador had already acquired Irish citizenship, so he had to renounce it. Now he renounced it once he left office. He got it back, but so it was a bit of a shell game there. But for very senior positions, they will look a bit askance at that. Yes.
You mentioned that it's not political, Republican, Democrat. How important is workplace politics and being able to navigate that landscape?
And you mean in a partisan?
Like just working with other people and vying for promotions, things like that. That sort of politics, not the.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I don't think it's much different than most other large organizations. I mean, you need to go through a formal process, but you also need to go through the informal process. I mean, you need to kind of, for instance, if you wanted to serve in Saudi Arabia, you'd do well to cultivate people who work in that issue area. It's just sort of human nature. Workplace politics, I never found it particularly difficult. Particularly with political opinions, you tend to figure out what people's political opinions are after a while, but they rarely affect policy. And no matter what administration is in, whether it's Republican or Democrat, they are going to bring in a lot of political appointees that will be your bosses. But again, as I said, until unfortunately the previous administration, usually there weren't huge issues on divergence with the politicals coming in and the career people there. I do want to say this, having a career public service, in my view, is one of the essentials of having a functioning democracy. You need people who will be there no matter who is in office, and are faithful about delivering public service without sort of fear or favor. Now, does that mean everything goes smoothly in the government? Obviously not. It is a huge behemoth. But I do think that the vast majority of public servants in state and everywhere else are trying to do the best job they can for the taxpayers. When you go to some other countries and you see the level of corruption going on, for instance, in Suriname, people would say, well, is it a market-based economy? Is it a socialist economy? It's a corruption economy. And a corruption state of government, people don't even recognize it as corruption. The system is corruption. And you're slowly trying to improve that, but then you come back to the U.S. and you can get basic services out of the government. That's one of the bedrocks of Western democracies, that you have a nonpartisan civil service, and the Foreign Service is an important part of that going forward.
Can I ask maybe, well, if there's other questions, that's fine too, but what's it like to move through the world, literally the world, as a literal representative of the United States in all of its complexities?
Mm-hmm.
What's it feel like?
For me, it was a great feeling. As I said early on, I loved representing the United States, because I do think, and I've always thought that in general we're a force for good in the world. But you are always on. When you're overseas, you're never off. You are always a representative of the American government. You're not a representative of just yourself. So you always have to be careful about what you're saying. Again, we talked about partisan politics. You try very much never to show a partisan hand. You're there to support the policy. But really, every aspect of your life is a reflection not only on you, but on the embassy and on the government. So That's why sometimes when people get into scandals overseas, we have to pull them back as soon as possible to Washington. It's one of the tough things you do as a senior officer, is when you have to say that this person has lost confidence and needs to go because they're about to embarrass the United States government through their personal conduct. And then there, and also it's a fine line between, well, you do still have a personal life, but when does it sort of cross the line and intrude on things? And there are difficult things you have to do too. The most difficult thing I had to do in my career was while I was in The Hague. We had sent one of our communication specialists on a temporary duty assignment to Benghazi, and he was one of the 4 people who were killed in the attack on Benghazi, along with Ambassador Stevens. This was a fellow named Sean Smith, and a horrible thing for the family, horrible thing for our embassy. I was the one who had to wake his wife up at 3 a.m. to tell her husband had been killed, and I don't, any difficulty it was for me, it was just so much compounded for anyone who was in his family. But they're the things you just have to do. So it's not all bed of roses, but it's fun. But I think representing the United States abroad is a great honor, and I was always happy to do it. Did you have another question?
Yeah, I have a question. Going off of the partisan politics, would it be problematic applying for the Foreign Service if you've participated in partisan politics
No.
in the past?
No.
Okay.
No. No, before I joined, I was doing partisan stuff through college and grad school. So
Okay.
no. I mean, unless you're doing it for the Communist Party or that may raise a flag or two. Yes, sir.
So I had a related question to adaptability. You mentioned before, they give you some courses for language, but they also give you courses for cultural understanding of
Yes.
where you're going. And in terms of the countries that you've been, I know they were mostly Western, but did you find it hard to adapt to one place different than another? And how do they kind of see the safety of, and also kind of apply that in the department of kind of how they deal with the safety abroad, especially if you're going to a country that hasn't or
Right.
something like
Okay. 2 questions. The Foreign Service Institute offers a wide array of courses. Over the time, I took political tradecraft course, economic policy course. I didn't study a lot of economics, but important to know the basics at least. At various points in your careers, you're promoted. There's training, which it varies, and depending on where you're going. There are regional training that will talk about policies in a region. So yeah, and I will say this is one thing state has really stepped up over the last 10 to 20 years that wasn't there when I was there. It was largely just language training when I entered. Now they do a wide array of training. Security, always an issue. As an ambassador, the thing they tell us when we go up for our confirmation hearings is the first thing you want to say to the senators is that your primary goal is the safety and security of the embassy and its people. And it is, actually, particularly in today's world, with all the threats that are out there. You have to take those measures very seriously. That's why we have diplomatic security agents at every embassy. And as you said, it varies depending on where you are. In Norway, in the Netherlands, weren't a tremendous amount of security threats that I was worried about. When I was in Cyprus, we had a somewhat higher level of security. In Suriname, while we had no problem with the government, for some reason I was under a death threat from some ISIS affiliates who were in country, not because of Ned Nolan. I didn't care who the hell Ned Nolan was, but because I was the U.S. ambassador. It would have been anyone. So after my first year in Suriname, where I just had a driver, and drove myself around on weekends. My last 2 years in Suriname, I had a 24/7 armed security detail, and it was always in an armored car. So, fortunately, we never had an attack. And the two guys who had made this threat were eventually deported. But other places, if you're in a Baghdad or someplace like that, you're restricted to certain zones where you can go in. I've certainly had friends who were in Baghdad when the embassy was shelled. Often, I lost people I know in the bombings in East Africa in the late 90s. It's not a risk-free career. And there are some places where your family can't go, which are, as we call them, unaccompanied posts, just because the security threat is so high. If you do take one of those, your family does get a special allowance to help them stay here and offset the cost somewhat, but security critical. Yes?
What would be some of those unaccompanied posts?
A lot of Middle Eastern posts. And depending on Kiev at the moment is unaccompanied, even though it was accompanied until the war started. There are fewer now than there were, say, 10 years ago.
Depending on what's going on.
Yeah. Afghanistan would have been all. We had several posts in Afghanistan that would have been all unaccompanied. Now we're not even in Kabul at the moment. But there's still some in the Middle East. I'm trying to think of others. There are fewer than there were. It used to be virtually anywhere in what we call the Near East and Asian Affairs Bureau, but not anymore. Yes, sir.
Let's make this the last question.
Okay.
Let everybody take off.
Yeah, what was the most challenging task that you were assigned during your career, and if it differs, what was the most rewarding?
I'm going to say getting Sinn Féin, and through Sinn Féin the IRA, to lay down their arms, which they didn't want to do, even though they were committed to the peace process. The gun had such a resonance in Irish Republican. Also, that it was very hard. We had to work a lot with Adams, McGuinness, who, frankly, we're both. Martin McGuinness, in some ways, a former terrorist, but became a true statesman after the Good Friday Agreement. Eventually being Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland, but tremendous commitment to the process. And working with him, we were able to get them, while I was there, to start the process of putting weapons beyond use, as they called it, and by 2005, having gotten rid of all their weapons. I'm not saying that former member of the IRA has a gun in Northern Ireland. I'm not that naive. But the main amount is away. So I found that personally very rewarding, because I'd always had a great interest in Ireland and in Irish politics. I would say on a much broader scale, the work we did in the 80s that led to the end of the Cold War. I mean, world changing. And, there were many hands involved, and even to have a small part in it was very rewarding.
Well, thank you so much for being here. This is really generous, and all these great questions. We appreciate all of you guys being here too. We could probably linger for a few minutes if you'd like, but I just want to make sure that we finish on time in case Ambassador Nolan needs to take off and in case you guys have classes. But at first, let's thank him for his time.